Hello, today we'll be talking about treatment of the mentally ill, as shown by Ken Kesey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Scientist and researcher Ty Colbert has spent the last 35 years studying and working with individuals suffering from serious mental health conditions. In his article about the history of biopsychiatry, or the study of biological function in terms of mental disorders, he theorizes that biopsychiatry has been able to exist over time primarily as a fallacious medical profession with the main goal of the restraint and control of others. In general, Colbert assumes a pessimistic perspective on the practices associated with biopsychiatry. However, he later concedes that not all psychiatrists malpractice and attempt to control a person's feelings, emotions, and behavior through the use of drugs and other medicalized procedures. One of his main claims is that biopsychiatrists and geneticists freely admit that they do not know what causes mental illnesses, especially since biopsychiatry is the only medical specialty that treats disorders without clearly known causes. This is because there is no tangible way of diagnosing and treating mental disorders. However, biopsychiatrists throughout the years have bypassed this, since disease models can be built around a certain behavior if a somatic procedure can be developed that shows a reduction in symptoms. In the instance of Ken Kesey's novel, this is portrayed by Big Nurse administering a lobotomy treatment to both Mr. Tabor and McMurphy. There is a perceived reduction in their boisterous behavior, which legitimizes this treatment. However, Colbert believes this to be outdated and primitive.
Group therapy is one of the first morally correct treatments that was used for the mentally ill and is also the ideal treatment that was to impact the patients on Big Nurse's ward. Moral management programs came about in the late 1700s and became the first therapeutic programs to have any success. This method focused on the patient as an individual with beliefs and potential, rather than just another physical presence. These programs fell in the late 1800s due to overcrowding and economic loss. However, the foundation of many current group therapies and humanitarianism movements are based off of this. On pages 48 and 49, Chief is relaying the theory of group therapy the way he has heard the doctor explain it countless times over. In this passage, Kesey employs plain diction in order to signify the difference in status between the doctor and Chief. One would assume that a doctor would use more elevated vocabulary than a patient, so Chief's usage of unsophisticated words demonstrates not only his hidden intelligence, but also the prolonged amount of time he has spent on the ward. Kesey also uses choppy syntax to mimic the haphazardly way Chief is recalling the mantra ingrained in his mind. A sentence such as, "and participate in group discussion," is merely a fragment, yet it represents his scattered thoughts and poor recollective ability. This serves to encourage the unreliable nature of Chief's narration and further introduces the reader to Chief's mindset. Finally, Kesey assumes an uninterested tone in an ironic manner in order to accentuate the hypocritical hospital policy. Chief recites the group therapy theory as though it holds no significance to the ward or himself, which is unexpected considering the ward claims that the theory is the basis for their treatment. However, both the reader and Chief are aware that the group meetings in the wake of group therapy are simply additional vehicles for the manipulation of patients, bringing relevance to the ironic tone.
Refer to pages 162 to 164 for electric shock therapy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Electric shock therapy was first introduced in the 1930s with the purpose to biologically cure patients of mental disease by inducing seizures. Ty C. Colbert came to the conclusion that, quote, the changes in behavior did not result from some medical or biological correction, but because of the fear of a hellish procedure that caused horrifying seizures, end quote. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Harding speaks of EST as an opportunity rather than a punishment. Ken Kesey conveys his use of diction, represented in red, through words such as fortunate and service to portray that Harding seems to think optimistically about this procedure. Not only does this give mixed feelings to the audience, but it also exfoliates the control the Big Nurse has over the patients, making them believe that it is for their own good and benefit. The tone, represented in orange, is misleading and almost ironic, suggesting that, quote, a few burnt brain cells won't hurt you, end quote. In the next message, Ken Kesey describes the procedure as, quote, cheap, quick, and entirely painless, end quote. The syntax, as before, is in dialogue form, with Harding speaking to McMurphy about EST in a comforting but restrained way, as if the walls are listening to their conversation, reporting back to Big Nurse the gossip they hear. In the last passage, by using the diction portrayed in red, Kesey juxtaposes a harsh medical treatment such as EST with a fun, kid-friendly carnival. This allows for the audience to find a connection between a lost carnival memory of their own and the experience of the EST victims are going through. Lastly, the syntax highlighted in blue refers to asyndeton, which emphasizes the relationship between the three words image, emotions, and memories, end quote.
According to Colbert, a lobotomy is yet another extremely cruel, disabling method that biopsychiatry has adopted as a medical treatment. It is essentially a surgical procedure by which nerves in the frontal lobe are cut via the insertion of a pick into the eye sockets. This destroys the prefrontal cortex, or part of the brain responsible for cognition and logical thought. By severing these neuronal pathways, biopsychiatrists are able to alter the behaviors of the mentally ill. On page 269 of the novel, Ken Kesey describes the aftermath of McMurphy's lobotomy. The patients are crowded around each other, and vulgar diction such as stupid, hell, crap, damn, and bitch are used to convey the patient's discontent toward the big nurse in McMurphy's lobotomy. The patient's diction is almost accusatorial, reflecting the broken power dynamic within the ward. The patients also make comments about McMurphy's new appearance after the lobotomy. The old, boisterous McMurphy is gone, and in his place is a disabled vegetable, as they are called. The patients speak as if McMurphy is a dummy put in place by Big Nurse in the Combine, which creates a tone of denial. For example, Scanlon and Chief ridicule the crummy fake, but they also go back to sneak a look at McMurphy's face, since they cannot fathom the fact that he is essentially brain dead. Ken Kesey also paints a vivid picture of what McMurphy looks like after the procedure. He uses picturesque diction and imagery such as a swirl of red hair and heavy purple bruises to highlight the change in McMurphy's physical attributes. Kesey also employs syntax in the last chapter. For example, he has a short sentence which could even be considered a dependent clause in the middle of the paragraph. The sentence fragment is surrounded by long, detailed sentences about McMurphy's thrashing about, and this short sentence, until the thrashing stopped, signifies a major turning point or event in the novel, which is that McMurphy, or the patient's savior or Christ figure, is finally dead.
Now let's talk about the reintegration of patients into society. In our scholarly article, we found that the goal of mental institutions was to remove mentally disabled people from the streets and place them into hospitals where they could turn into sober and industrious citizens. On pages 40 through 41 in the book, Chief describes the reintegration process of Maxwell Tabor after he has received his lobotomy. This passage is similar to the argument of the paper in that it calls for the reform and return of patients into society. The passage is structured into a paragraph on the ward's role of fixing the patient, the experience of the patient while in society, and the feelings that the town has after the patient dies. Throughout the passage, Kesey employs the use of short, objective, factual sentences when he describes the process of integration. An aloof, unfeeling tone alludes to the idea that the process is very rigid and has been seen many times before by Chief. An ironic tone comes in when Chief says, "Everybody's happy with the dismissal," because the lobotomy that expedited this dismissal inevitably leads to the patient's death. However, when Kesey describes the process of reintegration and the patient's experiences in society, long sentences are used. These elaborate sentences speak to the quick whirlwind nature of the reintegration process. In this sentence, for instance, a long drawn-out description is given of the patient's daily life. In addition, asyndeton is used to showcase the repetition of the patient's robotic motions. The tone in these long sentences throughout the passage is almost in awe of the situation and speaks positively to the reintegration process as a whole. In addition to long sentences, polysyndeton is used to elaborate the long list of places where the hospital draws its patients. The emphasis on neighborhoods and schools and churches speaks to the broad reach that the hospital has over the community. The metaphor of the ward as a factory is prominent in this passage. Kesey describes the patient as a product that came in all twisted, but after treatment is a functioning component with a welded grin. The use of metaphor here creates the idea that the patient is not human, but rather a product with an expiration date, a number that the reader should not care about until it is fixed by the Combine. Finally, the use of positive connotative diction shows the ward's view of the reintegration process. Words like better, new man, and inspirational figure describe the patient after the reforming process. The patient only matters to people after it had been manufactured by the Combine. This positive diction speaks to the idea that the ward's job of reinventing people should be praised. Again, this annotation shows how all of these rhetorical devices function in order to further Kesey's messages.
Pills and medication are a type of treatment that were described as being used to sedate the inmates by Ty C. Colbert in our scholarly article.
In these passages from page 78 of the book, Kesey uses diction with negative and controlling connotation. He uses words such as paralyzed when describing the effects of the pills, as well as using diction such as little red capsule and red pills when referring to the drugs, but never say what they actually are, furthering the reader's awareness of the effects of the pills have on the patients. The effects of the pills on the patients is further shown through the long, drawn-out sentences reflecting the sleepy and sedated effects the medications give their recipients. This is also shown in the constant ominous tone that Kesey uses when talking about medication and the things the patients see when they both take and don't take their medication. This tone can be seen more apparently in the passage underlined. These next passages, taken from page 53 of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, are also a great example of the ominous tone that Kesey uses when speaking of medication. Kesey conveys this with his usage of diction with negative connotation, such as the words mortify and poison, both words that normally aren't used when describing a treatment that is supposed to cure people. The words in purple utilize asyndeton to emphasize the total body control these tiny red pills have. In the second passage, the author shows a tone of lost hope through the italicized phrase, and by saying that ever since Pete was given the medication, he's just given up his individualism. Once again, this annotation shows how Kesey utilizes rhetorical devices to further his message of the medications and their purpose in treating the mentally ill.
Our motif is this drawing of the brain. Basically, it shows the brain being the center of all these different treatments, including EST, lobotomy, medication, and group talk therapy. And it shows the strain and chaos that can result from all of these treatments.
Our thesis was, biopsychiatrists such as Big Nurse have been able to establish a system of oppression over their patients by utilizing primitive biopsychiatric methods to control their feelings, emotions, and behavior. The harsh treatments used were not rooted in scientific research, meaning that biopsychiatry had no tangible way of diagnosing and treating mental disorders. The malpractice of psychiatrists was harmful to patients and was solely an effort to legitimize their methods, despite psychiatry being the only medical specialty that treats disorders without clearly known causes. In Cuckoo's Nest, Kesey is aware of this mistreatment and constructs Big Nurse's ward as the epitome of an unjust mental institution. He does so by emphasizing the inhumane treatment of the patients and bringing to light their ultimate oppression.